thank you very much for the Japan Society for the invitation to be here this afternoon. It's a great opportunity to, I think, talk about something that's become particularly contentious and controversial. Trade is not normally so in the spotlight to the extent that it has been during the presidential campaign, and it is currently at the moment. And there is obviously a lot of well-founded interest in where the current administration is heading. It's worth recalling, of course, that during the campaign season last year, Hillary Clinton also took a position on trade, which certainly, while different to Trump's, also indicated growing discomfort, I think, amongst the Democrats about trade and globalisation and where that was heading, though we did, of course, end up with Trump as president, and he's taken a particular course on trade and globalisation and the institutions that underpin it, which I think are raising a lot of questions in the United States and also globally about where this is all headed. And we've got a fantastic panel with us today to discuss that. So I'm going to introduce them briefly. I think you've got bios, and then we're going to have a moderated conversation for a while, and then we will open it up to Q&A after that. On my immediate left is Ambassador Charlene Bashevsky, who is currently Senior International Partner at WilmerHale in Washington, D.C. She joined WilmerHale after serving as United States Trade Representative from 1997 to 2001, and before that was acting and deputy USTR from 1993 to 1996. She accomplished much, and I won't go through each one individually. I will note, though, that Ambassador is best known as the architect and negotiator of China's accession to the World Trade Organization, and she was also instrumental in developing in opening the Vietnamese market, which led to the normalization of relationships between the United States and Vietnam. She's been honoured by both Harvard and Yale Law School, is a frequent lecturer and op-ed contributor, and serves on the board of directors of American Express and Estee Lauder, to name a few. Edward Alden is the Bernard Schwartz Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he specialises on United States economic competitiveness. He's actually the author of a recent book called Failure to Adjust: How Americans Got Left Behind in the Global Economy, which I think is going to probably be part of our conversation today. He's written other books as well, most notably The Closing of the American Border, Terrorism, Immigration and Security Since 9/11, which was a finalist for the Lucas Book Prize. Prior to joining Council of Foreign Relations, he was Washington Bureau Chief for the Financial Times, and prior to that was the newspaper's Canada Bureau Chief based in Toronto. He's been managing editor also of Inside US Trade and has appeared numerous times on various TV and other media places. So we've got an extremely qualified panel and an opportunity now to, I think, delve into some of the fascinating and troubling circumstances that we find ourselves in. And so that leads me, I think, to want to start with a fairly basic but I think difficult question, which is, how did we get here, and what's going on in the United States that is driving the politics around trade and globalisation. We constantly hear about the loss of manufacturing jobs, and we know that there was a particularly large loss of manufacturing jobs between 2000 and 2010, but this is a trend that's been going on for decades. There's been a lot of work done on how much you attribute to trade, how much you attribute to productivity and the like, but nevertheless, the narrative which seems to have taken hold, at least politically, is the United States has become a victim of globalisation. We're subject to bad trade deals, and that it's sort of generating a political discourse that is potentially leading the United States to turn its back on globalisation, turn its back on trade in a way which has probably never been seen before. So I'd love to, Charlie, I'll start with you, if you would provide some insights into what's going on here.
So let me first provide a little bit of context. The U.S. has always had a bit of a love-hate relationship with trade and trade agreements, starting with Alexander Hamilton, which makes me want to burst into song. Starting with Alexander Hamilton through the Civil War period, of course, during the Great Depression, when the view was the U.S. cannot compete with low-wage countries. World War II, we see a respite in the way post-war Americans think about trade. Why? Because we were the only major country left standing, and we had no obvious competitors in sight. Then you see the reindustrialization of Japan and Germany, allegations of unfairness, of closed home markets, of export-dependent economic models, as well over time of currency manipulation. Then you see the rise of the Asian tigers, further charges of unfairness, then NAFTA. And NAFTA crystallized this view that trade is unfair, that it leads to wage compression, that it leads to manufacturing job loss, and that countries that have low labor and environmental standards have an unfair cost advantage. Then enter China. Same set of arguments, but on a scale almost unthinkable given China's size. And you see in polling data these ups and downs of the view of globalization, of global economic integration, and of trade. And if you look around the world, this isn't an isolated phenomenon to the United States. If you look at the top 25 wealthiest economies, 550 million people have seen their wages stagnate or fall over the last 10 years. Innovation's harder, so it's not creating that jobs engine. We're in a bit of actually of an innovation trough right now. Not creating new jobs to absorb manufacturing job loss. Rapid increases in productivity over this time have yielded the bulk of job loss in the U.S., including in manufacturing. And you see, sort of from this globalization debate in both wealthy but also mid-market countries, a feeling of a loss of national identity and threat. And in Europe, that's evidenced in anti-immigrant sentiment, and in the U.S. in anti-trade sentiment as well as other things. So the pressures on the system are very, very great. And when you look at polling data, 2014, about 55 to 60% of Democrats, interestingly, and Republicans supported trade agreements. 2 years later, 30% of Republicans supported trade agreements. The Democratic number remained almost unchanged. And the last point I'd make is, before the election cycle, this election cycle, when people were asked about trade, they'd give somewhat negative views. But on an unaided question, list your top 18 concerns going into the election cycle. Trade was 18th of 18. Coming out of the election cycle with this pounding rhetoric on both sides, pounding rhetoric against trade, 85% of elites said that U.S. involvement in the global economy is a good thing. 49% of the public said no. U.S. involvement in the global economy is not a good thing, even though 95% of the world doesn't live here and 80% of global purchasing power doesn't emanate from the U.S. So these views are now not necessarily embedded. I think they are subject to change, but are reflected in part in the Trump election victory and in his trade policies.
Let me follow up quickly on that. You made an interesting observation, which is that the polling seems to show that support for trade agreements is actually collapsing amongst Republicans, yet remains relatively strong amongst Democrats. Looking forward, how do you see that playing out in terms of the positions that the two parties might take in a post-Trump world? Can we see the Dems being the party of trade and globalization in 5-10 years' time, and the Republicans increasingly looking inwards?
I think it's actually very hard to know. And I think it's hard to know because, as we've seen even in this election cycle, so much depends on leadership and on the way in which the public responds to leaders' claims of what's good for the economy or what isn't, what's positive, what's negative. I think the public view can actually become much more fluid depending on who the leaders of the two parties are, whether they speak to the public in an honest way, and Ted's written a lot about this. He's written a lot about everything I've just said. I'm just mimicking things that he has said. But I think a lot of this depends on the two parties stepping up to the economic reality the United States faces, both in the US as well as globally, and then the leaders of those parties beginning to change the debate. It's hard to imagine Democrats being the parties of open trade, given where their core constituency is, but I think over time it's not at all impossible to change attitudes and perceptions.
So let me bring you in. What has gone wrong? What has the government not done? Is there a solution? Is there a government policy solution here, or is it deeper and more complex than that?
Well, I mean, in some ways I take 300 pages of very small type in my book to try to answer that question, so I will be much briefer. Let me first off just say I'm delighted to be here and a great chance to be with you, Ambassador Barshevsky, again. I would echo everything that Charlene has said, but I would add one thing that I think is very important in understanding this. Economists for a long time have told us, and I think accurately, that trade has broad benefits and concentrated costs. We benefit, all of us generally, as consumers from growing international trade. And the more the United States has traded, and we trade a lot more today than we did 40 or 50 years ago. Basically, our economy is roughly 3 times as integrated into the global economy as it was in the 1960s. So, look at the good story out of that. So this the clothes I'm wearing today, Charlene and I were talking about textile trade over lunch. Everything I'm wearing today comes from somewhere else. My suit was made in Colombia, my shirt was made in Indonesia, tie and the shoes are from China. I think my underwear's from Egypt, but I won't check. But the average household in 1970, when almost everything I wore would have been made in the United States, spent about 7% of its household budget on clothing. Today, that number's about 3%. You go into any retail outlet and they're giving clothing away. So we all, have a lot more money in our pockets. And you can tell the, same story with, television sets, with, modern consumer electronics. My iPhone was made in, 28 different countries. Price is a lot cheaper than it would have been if it was all made domestically. So there are all these broad benefits. But we also know that there are concentrated costs. And they're particularly in those places exposed to manufacturing import competition. And there's a lot of conversations that we can have about manufacturing, but we know that manufacturing employment as a share of the economy has been declining steadily for a long time. And then really, as in total numbers, fell off a cliff in the 2000s for a variety of reasons, but it happened to be coincidental with China's entry into the WTO. The United States basically lost 6 million manufacturing jobs in the 2000s out of about the 17 million that we had at the time. We've recovered a little bit coming out of the recession. But you have to remember, those were jobs of a particular sort. Those were jobs that paid good wages, normally union wages, to individuals with fairly modest levels of education. Sometimes high school, sometimes even less, at the most a bit of community college training. And when those jobs disappeared, it had an extraordinary impact in the communities that they disappeared from. And you see this when you travel, as I do, around what we call the Rust Belt in this country. And if you look at what happened in the election, getting back to the politics and leadership, whatever one wants to say about Donald Trump, this is a very old issue for him. When he first began flirting with the idea of running for president in the 1980s, he took out a full-page ad, New York Times, Boston Globe, Washington Post, denouncing, we're here at the Japan Society, denouncing Japan over its large trade surplus with the United States and saying, why are we paying to defend Japan militarily when it's screwing us on trade? So this is a very, very old issue for Donald Trump. And in the election campaign, he went to a lot of these communities. The paperback edition of my book that's coming out, my foreword, I set when Donald Trump went to this little town south of Pittsburgh called Monessen, Pennsylvania, which was one of these steel towns that used to have a population of 25,000, now has a population of 7,000. No president or presidential candidate had visited Monessen since John F. Kennedy in 1962. And Trump went there, gave his big speech on trade in the campaign. And for whatever reason, those people felt heard by Donald Trump. And if you look at where the election was decided, having to do with the quirks in our electoral college system, it was decided in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, in Ohio. I would throw in North Carolina. Well, what do those states all have in common? They were all the states most exposed to manufacturing import competition and the one where manufacturing job losses were the biggest. So this issue really had a lot to do with what happened in November. I didn't answer your what to do question, but I wanted to kind of set the scene a little bit more first.
Could I add
Sure.
one point on that, if I may be interested also in your comments, which is the financial meltdown in 08-09. I think this has had, well, at the time, obviously, this had extraordinary impacts on the entirety of the country, but most especially when one considers the way most Americans live, which is on the margin. There are no surplus savings. You lose your job, you lose your home. And when you have, in a period of a year or 18 months, the wiping out of somewhere around $5 trillion in wealth, the impacts were devastating. And for many families caught in this, their recovery hasn't occurred. I'm not sure they will recover in their lifetimes. And I think this also added not only to the job loss issue, but added to the attitude, something's gone wrong and I'm on the short end of the stick. What just happened? The rich are getting richer. Of course, income inequality in the last 10 years has accelerated. The rich are getting richer and mightily richer, and I'm going down or staying the same. And so when you look at more recent polling data and you see Americans for the first time since the post-World War II era saying they believe their children will not do as well as they did, the attitudinal shift and this underlying concern, and in the case of many, lack of hope, is extremely profound and affects attitudes not only with respect to trade and globalization, but attitudes more broadly. And that's, I think, another factor in this mix.
Yeah, let me just say quickly, there was a Federal Reserve study that came out last year that suggested that about half of American families don't have $300 set aside for an emergency. That's how much they're living on the edge of their lives being disrupted. And if you look at the manufacturing job loss, it was fairly steady over the 2000s, even prior to the recession. But a lot of it was mass. Construction industry was booming, so there were jobs there. The value of houses was going up, so people who owned their homes felt reasonably confident. Well, when those jobs disappeared, look at what happens to the value of your home. And when the financial crisis, value of your home goes underwater. The logical response, we talk about adaptability, what should people do? Well, one logical response is to move to where the jobs are. I was out in California recently. There's huge demand out there. Well, you're going to move from a Midwest factory town where, if you're lucky, you're going to make a few dollars of profit on your house, and then you're going to move to Palo Alto and get what, a 25 square foot apartment for what you were paying for your house in Wisconsin. So there are a lot of these barriers that make it very, very, very difficult for people to respond to the concentrated, and let me be clear, broad benefits from trade, but make it very difficult for them to respond to the concentrated costs when they are visited on them.
So it'd be worthwhile, I think, just drilling down a little bit further into the broader sort of economic and labour market challenges which you outline and linking it up with the trade debate. So 6 million jobs lost between 2000 and 2010. There's been a range of work that's been done trying to work out how much of that was from trade. We can debate that, but the figures tend to be around the 20-25% mark. Productivity, I think the technology thing is not as inseparable from trade because you might introduce technology if you're competing, but let's say the rest is productivity and technology. What does this, though, mean about the economic challenges, which are real, and the way that the administration has interpreted those challenges and the types of solutions they're proposing. Are we heading in the right direction in that regard? How much of it can be fixed through trade policy, or what else does it require?
Do you want me to just? I'll start off quickly. I mean, I think if you look at that whole set of challenges, it's about making it possible for people to adjust to rapid economic change, whether driven by trade or technology or changing consumer preferences or other things. And particularly for the jobs that are being created now, they require higher levels of education, at the very least, decent kind of community college technical training. What this administration has talked about so far would make the situation for a lot of those people worse than it is currently. I mean, the Trump budget proposes a 20% cut in Department of Labor programs, huge cuts in community college funding, technical training, apprenticeships. You look on the healthcare front. I mean, one of the huge challenges that people face in an economy where work is less secure, think of the gig economy with the Uber drivers, is they don't have secure health insurance because it comes from your employers. Well, what's this administration trying to do on health insurance? Will make it less insurance for fewer people. So a lot of the things the administration is doing on that front, I think, are going in exactly the wrong direction. There are real issues on the trade piece, and I think we'll get into them in terms of our trading relationships with other countries, where they're fair, where they're not fair, how we could do trade policy better. But I think at the end of the day, it's a very small piece of the issue. And unfortunately, so far it seems to be the only piece of the issue that this administration is focusing on.
Yeah.
And I think on that piece, with respect to what the administration is focusing on, think about today's economy versus 20 years ago, and think about where the administration is focusing its policy efforts. It's focusing its policy efforts in areas where trade may be unfair, and if trade is unfair, that's got to be rectified. Period, full stop. I've always been an enforcement hawk, and I remain an enforcement hawk. But it can't be that the future of the United States will hinge on steel, aluminum, coal, air conditioners, and the few other areas the administration is focused on, let alone NAFTA renegotiation, the effects of which have long since been absorbed by the American economy. So, yes, clean up unfair trade practices if there is unfairness. But you have to look ahead at where the global economy is going, where our own economy has to go, and quite apart from the very important budget and other issues, which are the most critical, to be frank, the most critical with respect to the future, you have to say, right, what's wrong with the current system? Well, part of what's wrong with the current system is that the global rules under which our economy operates and most economies operate were the product of the Uruguay round of trade negotiations. That round concluded in 1994. But you see, the agenda that led to that conclusion was inaugurated in 1986.
And 1993, actually. I was there, December 15th, 1993, when Mickey Cantor hadn't had 4 days of sleep.
Exactly right.
It was a long time ago.
I remember that because I had to suffer under his no-sleep regime. So that round was inaugurated on an agenda from 1986, but hang on, no. That was the second attempt at inauguration. The first attempt was 1984, meaning the agenda for the global rules under which we operate, in most sectors, not in all, but in most, were drafted before 1984. This is 2017, right? So your iPhone is about 10 years old. Facebook is less than 10 years old. Amazon. I mean, think about where the economy is today. So the rules have to be rewritten in many, many areas. What would have rewritten the rules? TPP. TPP took all of the old rules, cleaned them up, updated them, slashed tariffs, which are taxes, slashed tariffs, and then spent most of its time addressing the new economy, whether with respect to investment or digital trade or e-commerce or cyber or state-owned enterprises and the uses of state capital or intellectual property rights or a rift of other issues, And what did the administration do? Walked away. Walked away when almost half the global economy was saying yes. We said, no, no thanks. It's better to live under the rules written pre-1984? I don't think so. So when you don't like the system that you have, you rewrite it. You rewrite it. And that's what needs to be done. It's what had been done as a start and what the administration walked away from.
Okay, so let's talk about the TPP because it's obviously a topic which is important here today in the Japan society, and I think one where anyone who pays any attention to trade is deeply disappointed with that outcome. Maybe starting from a sort of bigger picture, what does the US walking away from TPP mean for the US? What does it mean for Asia? What does it mean for Japan? The administration always talked about sort of the economic and strategic elements of the TPP, and I think it's sort of maybe worth pulling out the strategic elements a little bit, given I think that some of the challenges that the Trump administration is presenting towards some of these like deeper institutional economic norms that undergird a lot of the trading system. And so how do you see that? How much harm is being done? Is it going to be long-lived? Is it something a new administration could possibly reverse?
Well, would you like to start?
Sure.
I don't want to dominate.
We can. Why don't we start with
let me frame it, and maybe you can go into
great.
I would just say, two broad things about the TPP that made it particularly important. One, from the U.S. perspective, it was an end run around the stalemate in the global trade negotiations. I mean, the Uruguay round, as Ambassador Barshevsky points out, was the last successful round. We launched the Doha round in 2001 and never came to fruition. And largely, it was because you had powerful developing countries, China, India, Brazil, which have formed a kind of blocking minority in the global trade talks. They would say that, we form the blocking majority regardless. It hasn't been possible to do a deal. So TPP was a way for the United States to get around that, as was the negotiations with Europe, the TTIP negotiations. So that was one. It was a way to unblock this complete stasis in the system. The second, and I think more important, was there was a powerful incentive built into the TPP structure to provide some real leverage against China and other countries. China, and we can go into a lot of detail, and Charlene understands this in a lot more detail than I do, but there are a lot of ways in which China is very difficult for global trade rules. China skirts the rules quite successfully in a lot of different ways. The genius of the Trans-Pacific Partnership was, once in place, it would have given economic benefits to companies located in the TPP member countries, be it Vietnam or Japan or Canada or the United States. And over time, we would have seen investments start to flow away from China, where a lot of foreign companies are already complaining about the difficulties in doing business. And that would have put the Chinese in a challenging position. They would have had to say, look, do we join onto these TPP rules in an effort to stem the loss of investment? Do we stay outside? I think it would have given the United States and other countries, Japan included, enormous leverage over China in terms of setting the rules for trade going forward. I think without TPP, we have given all that away. The notion that you can recreate that through a bunch of bilateral negotiations is, I just think, dead wrong. So I think strategically, it was just an enormous mistake for this administration.
So I absolutely agree with all of that. I mean, ever since World War II, the U.S. has been a rule maker, not really a rule taker. Yes, in the context of negotiation, yes, in the context of overall agreement. But when you think about the formation of the global system, This was on the basis of the U.S. and its post-war allies, one of which, by the way, was China, and its post-war allies deciding that there were two things that had to happen globally if the world was to move forward successfully. One was a reinvigoration of global growth, and the second was making countries much more economically interdependent as a means of cementing a fragile peace. And in the context of putting this system together, the U.S. extended and reinforced a system of alliances, and most especially, apart from Europe, in the Asia-Pacific, So this alliance structure of the United States has done several things. One, it has extended U.S. power and power projection around the world, allowing the U.S. to maintain, as near as possible, a more rules-based order, because this is critical as a normative matter in the United States, the basis on which all of our institutions are built, and in that way to give the United States a seat at the table, not every table necessarily, but a potential seat at the table as the world sort of moves ahead. TPP, put aside China for a moment. TPP was a reinvigoration and a cementing of that alliance structure in Asia, through which the vast bulk of our goods travel in the seaways, in which the U.S. has fought 3 wars in the last 70 years, and which, in its own way, although more economically integrated, remains, for various reasons, somewhat less stable than one would like, and especially in the context of North Korea. Furthermore, this structure, this alliance structure, over time became almost too dependent on the United States. And what you really want to see, if you think about alliances, is not only a hub and spoke, U.S. in the center and spokes. You want those spokes to form enduring alliances as well. Remember, the goal is prosperity and stability. That's the name of the game. So you have a TPP that does all of those things: the rules, the projection of the alliance structure, the cementing of the alliance structure, and most important, the creation of this alliance structure, even pulling the U.S. out as a pin, which is why I think TPP 11 should move forward. This was vitally important for U.S. interests. Now add China. Because the first point is the U.S. needed to cement and reinforce its own interests. China sets up a different example. It's not the same rules. It's an autocratic regime. Think for a moment about global governance the last several hundred years. English-speaking, rule of law, democracy. That's actually what it's been when you think about British imperialism and then the United States for the most part. I'm not saying it's perfect by any means, it's not. Think about the reverse. Non-English speaking, autocratic, non-democratic. So from the U.S. point of view and a trade agreement's point of view, one wants to reinforce those aspects that provide this greater continuity. Yes, it's in our interest, but it's in the interests of our allies and our partners most especially. So the notion that we would pull away is the strategic error. Put aside the trade stuff. It is the strategic error, and it is a large strategic error. This is no small matter. And the idea that somehow we think the world will wait, I think is also mistaken. I think China very smartly has acted to move into the breach. Not only do they have the geographic advantage, They have a ton of money, which they're spreading out liberally in the region and through their One Belt, One Road initiative, concentrically over time moving out with respect to power projection, rules, and so on. So the United States really needs to begin thinking about these issues in a framework context, in a strategic, very broad way. I think it's very hard to have policies of the kind that Ted and that Joshua have written about. It's very hard when you have no framework for governing, and you have no framework for what the U.S. position in the world should be and what that world should look like. That's where you start. And then you backfill what the initiatives are. And right now, there is no framework, and it leads to decisions of the kind you've seen on TPP.
Just following up on the strategic mistake dynamic here, and just to pull it apart a little bit further, a lot of this, the US alliances structure are underpinned by treaties, but there's a lot of elements of certain norms of trust and expectation, stability and consistency. How can the US, or does the US recover that? Can it? How do allies interpret the current moment in US politics, and how do they think about how they can interact and rely on the US going forward?
I think that's a very complicated question. I think the essence of leadership is that when you deal with the leader of a country on a Monday, you need to know that on the Wednesday it will be the same position, and you need to know on the Friday it will be the same position. You need consistency, and you need trust. As you were saying, you need to develop that kind of trust. My own view is that, just use TPP as only one example, I think there ought to be a TPP 11. I think if our partners are to reinvigorate thinking in the United States and create leverage as against the U.S. as a means of pulling the U.S. back in, I think TPP 11 becomes actually quite important. If I were one of the allies, first of all, I would think about the diversification of my own exports. If the U.S. is going to be unreliable, I sure better have more alternatives than I have today, especially for those economies that are quite dependent on the United States with respect to exports. And furthermore, if I were one of the allies or partners in the Asia-Pacific, boy, I would want to know that I had a fairly strong periphery around China so that I could at least deal with China on a more equal basis. Many of these countries are small, and they're quite trade dependent on China. I'd want to even out the scorecard a little bit. Not as a means of containing China. You couldn't if you wanted to. It's a ridiculous proposition, but as a means of fair play. Fair play. So, and there are a bazillion other reasons why you would do TPP 11, but those are just two. That might be one way to get the administration, get the Congress, to begin to think maybe we ought to be changing course somewhat here, find a way to reinvigorate a TPP that the United States would be more comfortable with.
Can I make just one addition to this? I think this is going to be a really interesting test for the rest of the world. The great accomplishment of the WTO was the creation of a dispute settlement system for trade conflicts. I mean, in the past, it was basically just the biggest guy won, which was usually the United States. We would bully other countries by threatening to cut off access to our market. We now have internationally a system of rules and a process for trying to solve disputes. So I think this is going to be tested in very interesting ways in the next few years. And I'm hoping that a lot of America's trading partners will show a real commitment to that set of rules. So I would argue the United States in the past has by and large, lived up to both the letter and the spirit of WTO rules. Sometimes politically very difficult decisions like the elimination of an obscure thing called the FISC export subsidy, which Boeing and Caterpillar and others benefit from. Europeans won a challenge in the WTO. That was a very hard thing for the Congress to eliminate, did it anyway, because we believed in the rules. I think you're going to see this administration, the Trump administration, do things that probably violate WTO rules, or at least skate very much on the edge of them. And the issue for other countries will be, how do we respond? Do we respond in kind by imposing our own protectionist measures that are also probably a violation of WTO rules? Or do we trust the system? Are we patient? Do we take the cases to the WTO? Do we wait the 2 years that it's going to require to resolve them, even if there's some economic harm? And I think the world collectively has a huge interest in the stability and integrity of these rules. I think many of the things we've seen coming out of China since Trump's election have reinforced that. And so I think this will be the test in a way. Chrystia Freeland, Canada's foreign and trade minister, gave a very important speech a couple of days ago saying that Canada is going to double down on its commitment to these multilateral rules and institutions. I think that's going to be the challenge for the rest of the world, because the United States is not going to be the reliable leader that it has been in the past, at least for the next few years.
May I add just one thing to that? It was something that actually the three of us were talking about before coming out here, and that is the administration's use of a fairly obscure law on national security as a potential means of blocking imports into the U.S. So the administration has inaugurated national security review cases in the case of aluminum and steel. And the idea behind this particular law is that if those imports threaten to impair the national security, the president can act unilaterally. So first point, unilateral action of that sort might impact WTO rules. It's a little bit unclear when presidents invoke national security as a basis. But there's a more fundamental point. How does China justify its cyber sovereignty agenda and its hyper-nationalistic technology agenda? National security. How did it identify its strategic emerging industries, of which there are 15, strategic emerging industries, and special state aid to those industries to the discrimination of foreign companies? National security. How do any one of a number of developing countries justify blocking U.S. agricultural imports into those countries on the basis of food security as an element of national security? We can't trust imports because it's food, and therefore we don't want your imports. We'll grow our own, and if we don't have enough to grow, well, so be it. So countries around the world have used national security as a protectionist excuse. What is the U.S. doing invoking national security in the case of certain products when, in the case of steel, the bulk of imports come from Canada, a demonstrably reliable trade partner on our border and one of our longest-standing allies? If the trade is unfair, we have a lot of trade laws fully recognized by the WTO, not dependent on national security, to fix the problem. And if the trade's unfair, that problem has to be fixed, for sure. But invoking a law almost never used and investigating under it as a potential means to block imports puts many of our major exports at absolute risk in foreign countries who already do something similar or try to, but we challenge it persistently, or who will do so in the future on the basis, hey, US did it, I can do it too.
Yeah, just to underscore what a different world we are moving in, this law has not been used successfully since the end of the 1980s. So it's been almost 30 years since the last case of this sort. And these decisions are about to come. We will know by the end of the month whether the Trump administration is going to block steel and aluminum on security grounds. So a lot of trade issues, they kind of roll out slowly, and people are saying, oh, it's not going to be so bad. The Trump administration hasn't done things yet. There's a lot of stuff on the horizon very soon, including these two decisions by the end of the month.
Let's talk a little bit more then about China. There was a meeting between President Trump and Xi early on in the administration. There was a 100-day trade action plan of some sort. And then we saw more recently what has been called the United States-China Trade Agreement, which is not really a trade agreement, but it's sort of a political commitment to do a bit around some very specific market access issues, many of which had been in the works for a long time, and there was a bit of follow-up in a sense. I think more recently the administration has signalled they might be interested in reviving the bilateral investment treaty negotiations. How sort of, in a sort of nuts and bolts sense, how does sort of economic investment trade relations with China play out in the context of where Trump was on the campaign trail, which was a lot of heated rhetoric around currency and the like, which is somewhat died down. The Treasury Department said they're not manipulating currency, which everyone had known had not been the case for many years. Is it sort of a transactional relationship that goes anywhere fast? And how also does China, do you think, see the administration? How do they play how do they take advantage of the current approach of the administration to trade? I mean, Ambassador, you talked about the speech that Xi gave shortly after the US withdrew from the TPP at the World Economic Forum. Are they going to try to increasingly step forward and play the role of global economic leaders? Can they do that? Is it credible? And what does this mean for the United States?
I mean, let me just start quickly with the administration and what they said during the campaign and what they've done. I mean, certainly, if you take seriously what Donald Trump said during the campaign about the negative impacts of unfair trade on U.S. manufacturing industries, then China has to be the top of the list in terms of your concerns. And possibly it will get there. The new U.S. Trade Representative, Bob Lighthizer, was a deputy U.S. Trade Representative in the Reagan administration, has written and spoken about trade with China in ways that suggest that he would like to get tougher on the issue. But so far, what we've seen out of this administration is very little, in fact. They didn't go forward with candidate Trump's promise to label China as a currency manipulator. Now, there were good reasons not to do that because China's actually manipulating in the other direction at the moment. But so he stood down on that campaign promise. And then in terms of focused trade actions regarding China, we really haven't seen much yet. This deal that you talked about was a very kind of transactional deal in which China promised to address a series of long-standing U.S.-China trade issues. President Trump has talked about going easy on the Chinese because they're going to help us with the North Korea problem. Again, quite contrary to what he suggested during the campaign, which is that we had sacrificed the economic interests of Americans for foreign policy interests. So that was almost a direct contradiction. So far what we've seen in terms of China and trade is very puzzling if you look at what he said during the campaign. So my crystal ball is fuzzier on this issue than any other because the actions so far do not accord very well with what he talked about in the campaign.
Yeah, I agree with that. China plays the long game. They're so good. They really are good at thinking about the future, where the country ought to be. They have plans to 2049, 2050, 2060, and then they back up to where they need to be now. So if you look at their plans, China missed the Industrial Revolution. And what it has said is we're not missing it anymore. We intend to lead. We intend to lead. And so you look at where resources are being put, it's on the future economy. It's on new materials, it's on biotechnology, it's on artificial intelligence, it's on cloud compute, it's on the various forms of telecommunications and other infrastructures, it's on satellites, it's on a variety of fields, semiconductors and others, that are the future of the economy and will themselves require manufacturing and lead to further manufacturing and other forms of jobs. And then if you look at the way Chinese companies invest in the US, Europe, and elsewhere, these investments tend to reinforce this longer-term agenda. So it used to be Chinese outward investment in commodities and energy, and those investments still certainly go on. Increasingly, investments are in technology, materials, chemicals, consumer products. And these parallel the transition the Chinese economy needs to make from export-driven investment dependence to consumer and services and technology innovation-driven. And they parallel this longer-term agenda. Then I look at the United States. We've already discussed that. I'm not sure where we're going at all in that context. And then we look at the trade agenda with China. Beef's a good thing. Financial services, some liberalization there, that would be a good thing. These things need to be done. And I think the Obama administration was not tough enough on China. And on these practices that have persisted a very long time. They're not new. But where's the rest going? We're like submicro. While you see a foreign government that is looking much more holistically at the future positioning of its country and of its economy. And so I think the United States needs to back up, of course, our own house in order first and foremost. But then as we look at China, we have to think through the practices going on in China, which are pervasive, that have to be addressed. The use of state money to build these strategic sectors. These are all subsidy funds. They need to be addressed in a holistic fashion. We need to look at investment. It should be entirely reciprocal. If you can buy it here, and most countries can, we should be able to buy it there. You want to invest in one of our companies in a particular sector, we get to do the same. You want to buy one of our major ag companies, we get to buy your major ag companies. Investment is completely unreciprocated, and it needs to be reciprocal. And there has to be much more focus on that. So I would say tougher enforcement, more creative enforcement. There are lots of ways of doing that, which I'm sorry to say the Obama administration did not do. Much more reciprocal thinking on the part of the United States. And then I think you have to engage China in new negotiations. If you aren't going to do TPP, then you've got to find other ways of rewriting the rules. And with respect to China, there are a couple of very big areas. Services trade, which are poorly covered by the WTO, new products, and cyber agenda, including on the use of data localization, and so on. A lot of these areas are not well covered by the WTO or aren't covered by the WTO. And when it comes to where China's economy is going and its use of a variety of unfair practices to get there, we need to rewrite the rules and get at them.
In the US-China trade agreement, one of the last commitments was US recognition of the importance of One Belt, One Road. How significant is that? Is that and particularly if you're in Japan or you're in India or other parts of Asia, which have misgivings and concerns about the broader sort of implications, strategic and economic, of One Belt, One Road, is this a further sort of signalling that the US is going to be accommodating Chinese sort of, leadership in the region, and does that raise concerns, or is this sort of more just business as usual?
I mean, I'm mostly going to defer to Charlene on this, but had we been moving forward with the TPP, that would have bothered me less. I don't have a problem with China building out infrastructure in the region, with gaining economic advantage from building out infrastructure in the region. There are collective benefits to that. The problem is if the United States is not also there actively in the region, and TPP was the big initiative that put us there. And without that, then you do get into these questions of, is this in effect a kind of US abdication and a signal to the Chinese that we're not going to stand in your way, even on things that may really matter to us, like freedom of maritime commerce in the South China Sea. So
I think that's a fabulous point, which is to say TPP has left us really out of the picture. Yeah, I suppose some of our companies can participate in One Belt, One Road. China's been very clear that it welcomes participation from everybody. But that, again, is on a micro level when we should have been in TPP in the region. Look, I think One Belt, One Road it's a pretty brilliant conception. I think it's tough. You're dealing with a lot of countries that have very strong views on sovereignty, that don't want to be overly dependent on China, so on and so forth. But even if this were only partially successful, it would be a quite extraordinary achievement. The benefits, you're building out infrastructure in a region where the World Bank has estimated extraordinary infrastructure needs, which cannot possibly be financed only by governments. You need to bring in private investment as well. You obviously, as a global matter, want to see increases in living standards, reduction in poverty, and all the rest, and this kind of initiative could accomplish that. What else could it accomplish? Well, China could export its economic model. It's a statist model. China could export some of the worst excesses of its own economy, which is to say, unload its overcapacity in a variety of different areas, and indeed purposely embark on a system of overcapacity production to feed these areas, which is to say, exporting China's bubble out elsewhere. That wouldn't be very good. What else does it do? It creates a kind of monetary dependency, right? I'm going to finance your infrastructure, so be nice to me in the future. And countries are very concerned about that, of becoming unduly beholden. So all of these things pose challenges to the United States and to US leadership, and to the strength of other global institutions that typically have provided public goods. So on the one hand, provision of public goods is terrific. On the other hand, the export of China's particular brand of economic model is not so great for the United States. And as Ted said, pulling ourselves out of that milieu is yet a further strategic mistake.
I just want to, before I open up Q&A, I just want to turn quickly back domestically to what's going on in Congress with tax reform, and particularly proposals which still seem to be alive to do a so-called border tax adjustment. There's various quite strongly held opinions on whether this would be good or bad for the United States, not from a taxation perspective, which is a separate issue, but from a trade perspective. There are complicated questions about how, the extent the exchange rates adjust, how does the Western world respond. Just be interested in your sort of initial takes on whether you may have a view on whether you think this has got any legs in Congress or not, but more generally what this might mean for the US from sort of a US trade policy point of view.
Yeah, just quickly, comprehensive tax reform is exceedingly difficult. The last time it was done successfully was in 1986. The power of the lobbying groups in Washington is never seen in more in full flower than when it comes to tax issues. So very, very difficult to get these sort of things through. With respect to the border adjusted tax, the basic idea is that you would charge a tax on imported goods and exempt it on exported goods. It has to do with particular ways of deducting labor costs from your final tax bill. It affects companies very differently, and companies, particularly in the retail sector that are heavily dependent on imports, hate the idea. A lot of manufacturing companies too, including the auto sector, where they rely on a lot of imported components, also hate the idea. My hope is that it may actually begin to trigger a discussion of where the United States really needs to go, which is the adoption of some sort of value-added tax. Senator Hatch, actually in the last couple of days, has said this might be worth taking a look at, which was formerly something that Republicans would never talk about. But the United States is a real outlier here. Every other advanced economy has some form of value-added tax, which is a broad-based consumption tax. And that gives you real advantages in the trade environment because under WTO rules, quite legally, companies can have the value-added taxes they paid rebated when their products are exported, and they're charged on imports. And there are obviously balancing factors in all of this. But I think there's no question from a trade standpoint, there is some value in having a VAT. And you could use it as a pay-for reducing corporate tax rates. And the U.S. top-line corporate tax rate of 35% is now the highest among the advanced economies. It's a real competitive disadvantage in terms of attracting investment. So I hope it goes down that road. If you have to ask me for a prediction on the likelihood of comprehensive tax reform, I don't know, 10%. I think more likely we'll get a temporary tax cut. I think that's probably where it ends up, unfortunately.
The only thing to add is this issue of the border adjustment tax and the notion of putting a tax on imports and so on and so forth. There's a real confusion as to whether it would be WTO legal or not. With even the WTO Secretariat, which is kind of the final substantive word, not being entirely sure whether it would or wouldn't be. And part of the problem, of course, from the analytic point of view, is that there's only ever been an outline, sort of a one-pager, on what this might look like, and it's very difficult to assess legality on the basis of that. But we already know that Europe and Canada have said that if the U.S. went in the direction of a border adjustment tax, they would bring trade action against the United States and likely impose an offsetting tax on U.S. exports to those countries. So we could see, in any event, quite a bit of trade friction emerging, regardless of what the ultimate outcome would be in arbitration or in dispute settlement. Quite a bit of friction generated on the basis of what had been the previous Ryan proposal on a border adjustment tax.
Great. Let me open it up to the audience. If any questions, is there a microphone? Yeah, there's a microphone floating around. If you maybe want to, we do this at Brookings, I'm not sure if the norm here, just introduce yourself when you ask your question. Yep, gentleman up the back here.
Hi, my name's Michael Jeffers.
There's a
microphone. A microphone just coming to you.
Oh, hi, my name's Mike Jeffers. I agree with you that the failure to adopt the TPP was a huge mistake, but you seem to be bashing the current administration in its failure, and I think it's worth noting, and in fairness, that we'd never heard any criticism. I had never heard any criticism of the TPP until Bernie Sanders came along and started attacking it, and then Hillary Clinton came in and opposed it, saying, who flip-flopped on her position and previously had said it was a gold standard of trade agreements, as Ambassador seems to agree. So my question is, well, so all three major presidential candidates opposed it and stopped it. My question is, we seem to have failed on the political arena. So my question is, as a political matter, and what can the Council of Foreign Relations, what can you in the seat of power at Washington, D.C. legal circles, and what can the business community do to attract attention back to the importance of adopting the TPP 11 as you have endorsed? But there seems to be a major failure at the on the political side, and currently no support whatsoever for it from either political party.
I mean, I would absolutely agree with that. I think the collapse in support for trade has been thoroughly bipartisan. In fact, it occurred in the Democratic Party long before it occurred in the Republican Party. When President Clinton managed to get the NAFTA through the Congress, he did it with a minority of Democratic votes. His own party did not support him on NAFTA, and the support among Democrats in Congress for trade has eroded even further. On the Central American Free Trade Agreement, there were only 15 Democratic votes in the House in favor of that agreement. So this erosion has absolutely been across the board. I think there has been a real failing in leadership in Washington from the business community, from the political class. I mean, if you look over the last 30 years, support for trade has been eroding steadily. You could see the writing on the wall. I think the hope was they could pull a rabbit out of the hat one more time with the Trans-Pacific Partnership and get it through, which had happened before. It had been possible to pass these agreements really narrowly. But I think there were just a lot of warning signs, some of which we talked about at the outset in terms of people who were harmed by import competition. The politicians in Washington didn't take seriously the fact that trade was having some real negative impact in some places. We didn't think about support programs for workers. We didn't think about redesigning the safety net in important ways. And we didn't do enough on enforcement. I mean, certainly with China, an awful lot of what happened in the 2000s, I think there should have been much stronger pushback, both from the Bush administration and from the Obama administration. So again, bipartisan failure. There are a lot of folks in DC who are asking the question you asked, which is it possible to put this back together? And I don't think anybody has the formula exactly. I mean, I've produced a couple of papers with my colleague Bob Lighton talking about what you might be able to do domestically to try to rebuild support on trade. But it's really hard at this moment, and obviously you don't have a president for whom that is a goal. In fact, he just sees this whole issue very differently and is determined to lead it in a very different direction.
Yeah, I think Ted is right, and I think you're right. Absolutely. I thought the difference was, I think Bernie Sanders was dead set against TPP. I think Donald Trump was dead set against TPP. I think Hillary was set against TPP, but always couched the language as of now. I can't support it now. But she never said never. I think it would have taken a long time. I don't think it would have happened quickly, but I think she would have taken the time to consider and figure out how could it be fixed in a way that was more palatable. But putting that aside, no question the anti-trade rhetoric was from everybody throughout the campaign, leading, as I had said earlier, to the view that almost a majority of Americans thinks it's not good for the U.S., it's not good for the U.S. to be involved in the global economy. I think there are two big issues. One is growth. The U.S. has been in a slow growth economy for a long time. It is hard to sell people on initiatives when you're not growing. And so growth becomes a critical feature moving forward as a way to begin to change perception. I think the second is this issue of adjustment. There is nothing new about the fact that trade and technology create winners and losers. There's nothing new about community impacts when the steel mill closes. Nothing new. This was pre-NAFTA. It was very clear that there are communities, socioeconomic groups, geographic groups disproportionately impacted by trade and changes in technology. The failing has been political for as long as I can remember and for as many fights on the Hill as I was involved in, which is a failure, an absolute failure to, number one, put in place meaningful programs to assist workers, including programs, for example, like wage insurance, which is a common feature of programs that are successful globally. And number two, even as poor as the programs were, to fund them. And this became a political dividing line on the Hill as well, between Democrats and Republicans. But in total, the political system has failed for 35 years to take care of people who lose out in a global economy. It's not new. It's just that a combination of slow growth, of the wrap-up of technological change and productivity increases occasioned by it, particularly in the, say, mid-'80s to early 2000s, and then the knock-on effects, and the financial meltdown, which wiped out so many people. It's a combination of all of those things that I think has brought this to the fore. But the issue isn't new, and the congressional failure on this issue isn't new.
We'll take one, actually, start on the left, and we'll work our way over.
Hi, my name is Sean King at a firm called Park Strategies. Former Japan Society chairman and current Commerce Secretary Ross said that gains made with Canada and NAFTA, Canada and Mexico under TPP will be the jumping off point for renegotiating NAFTA. So if we have what could be considered a successful renegotiation of NAFTA, could that vindicate TPP and then give the administration a justification or window for revisiting it? Thank you.
Well, there's some people who think if you could renegotiate NAFTA by incorporating basically TPP, you could have a new docking station for other countries. To my mind, the tricky part, I mean, there are lots of tricky parts, but the really tricky part, if you're a member of Congress, do you actually vote to accept NAFTA? Think about it for a minute. If you want to talk about tough trade votes, there's no tougher trade vote than voting again to accept NAFTA. And then if you're a member of Congress and the administration wants to proceed bilaterally, okay, they do 5 bilaterals. What member of Congress wants 5 trade votes? There are no votes back home for 5 trade votes. So the political limitations or sensitivities need to be thought through very carefully by this administration as it proceeds on the basis it's thinking. But I agree with you. If you could bring in TPP, in effect, into NAFTA, and then you fiddle with the stuff that's NAFTA specific, some of which will have to be done, maybe you have a new docking station.
I mean, just to add to that, one of the interesting dynamics, obviously, with the TPP was that Canada and Mexico came in at a later stage in the negotiation where they essentially had to accept a lot of what had already been done. And this was actually also true for Japan, and also plays out in the way I think Japan thinks about a bilateral trade agreement with the United States. And in many respects, Canada and Mexico agreed to give a lot, and the United States gave very little just to be part of the group. And that dynamic is not going to be at play in this renegotiation. And I think it also underscores the fallacy that you're going to get a better deal bilaterally than using these large regional deals where there's much more opportunity for trade-offs across the members.
Let me make one comment on this issue of bilaterals. And when you do a big trade deal, you have rules, right? So there are rules, and then every country has their own, every country is different, and their regimes are a little different, and their barriers are a little different. So the rules are agreed. But then, bilaterally, there's schedules. And there's a schedule for Mr. Meltzer, and a schedule for Mr. Altman, and a schedule for Barshevsky. And those schedules can look radically different. So, had the administration understood that to begin with, it would have been very easy to say, we're redoing the TPP on a bilateral basis by keeping TPP at the rule level, and then bilaterally taking a look at each of these schedules and figuring out, are they adequate? The advantage to a broader-based agreement is most countries politically back home, every country has their politics. Most countries hate looking like they gave into the U.S. Easier to look like you gave into someone else. And so one of the advantages to these broader agreements, again, given that the schedules are all different anyway, is that countries can sometimes be more flexible, not less, because they're not given into the U.S. They're accommodating the group, or they're accommodating other countries. And that makes it easier for them to make concessions they otherwise, bilaterally with the U.S. alone, could never make, because politically back home for them, they can't take that risk.
As a former bilateral and negotiator for Australia in the bilateral United States trade agreement, I'm well aware of how difficult that is.
John Wheeler, you both mentioned others picking up the ball with the U.S. opting out of TPP, trade, globalization in general. And I wonder, where do you see this coming from? You both mentioned the importance of leadership, which the U.S. has traditionally been the one who's led these efforts, and that's not possible now. Where would this leadership come from? I mean, in Asia, in Europe, who can rally the troops if the U.S. can't? I mean, I know it's a dim hope, perhaps, but
I honestly think it will be harder. You know, I'm a political science student, and if you look at the stability of hegemonic systems, there's some reality to that. If you have one strong leader, it's easier to maintain a stable system, particularly if that leader is willing sometimes to sacrifice some of its short-term interests for long-term gains. So it's harder to do. But I do think we've had this 25-year experiment now with the WTO. If you look globally, we've had more people brought out of poverty over that period than any other comparable period in human history. A lot of that's a China story. Trade is generally popular in most of the world. Not very popular in France, not very popular in the United States, but most of the world is pretty favorable to trade. So it seems to me that in theory you could put together a kind of loose coalition of, Germany, China, Canada, Mexico. India's a little more problematic, but on certain issues. Enough significant countries that see a benefit in at least maintaining the system as it exists and doing further deals among themselves to try to move forward in a slow pace. My hope is that this becomes a kind of holding strategy and that the United States will rethink the path it's on in terms of trade, but that's obviously going to take a little while. So I don't think you're going to see the U.S. replaced in any way, but I can imagine a collective group that might at least be able to kind of keep the project alive until perhaps we can have another look at it here. Well, I don't think the Chinese are not capable of playing the role in the global trading system that the U.S. played. They just can't, for all of the reasons that Ambassador Barshevsky talked about. But I can imagine a China that's perhaps willing to think about its interests in the WTO on a somewhat longer-term basis. China plays the WTO for economic advantage. Where can we skirt on the edge of the rules in ways that we gain advantage towards the various goals that we have laid out? I could imagine a somewhat more moderate China saying, actually, we may need to pay a bit of a short-term price in order to maintain the stability and integrity of these rules. That's about as far as I hope China will go. I think China might realistically go. That's not a U.S.-type leadership position, but it's better than where China's been.
I think, the world isn't self-organizing. You need a leader or some group of leaders with a common vision and purpose and sufficient persuasive power, however we want to define persuasive, money or bona fides or moral authority, whatever.
Or a big market.
Or a big market. Enough, sufficient credibility and authority to bring the world along. I think certainly China is trying to suggest it is now the new global leader. It's rather preposterous when one looks at China's own economy. Their definition of globalization is, it's great your markets are open. Well, it means their market has to be open too, and we've seen a real regression there, even though they are a major global importer, no question about that. But we've seen a lot of regression there. So I think the more immediate issue, to my mind, is the Asia Pacific. There, I think, China, number one, absolutely wants to lead. It wants to control its space and its near borders, which is why you see the mischief in South and East China Sea. And in that region, I think it is entirely plausible that China could emerge in a leadership role. That is most assuredly what it is vying for, and most assuredly it would want to minimize the presence and authority of the United States. I don't think that's a close question, actually. I hope I'm not being too pessimistic, but I don't think so. Globally, where Ted is, I don't see China really assuming that role unless it does so incrementally through One Belt, One Road or through other initiatives. That might be a more incremental way to proceed because these kinds of big initiatives take a very long time. And I'm still, I think, where Ted is, which is, I hope, the United States takes a step back, begins to look at its global positioning and what our own goals are, and decides we need to make a mid-course correction.
Yep, this lady here. Yep.
Actually, I'm from China, so I feel the comments a little bit harsh on China. And about your opinion about China as a bad role player, I have thoughts on that. First, I was a lawyer in China, and I represent foreign investors to invest and expand their investment in China. And I could see Chinese updated their laws, regulations every year to try to implement their agreement to WTO. And the cyberspace AI or something, as you mentioned, its new product is not covered by WTO. So I feel if using those areas to accuse China does not comply with their agreement to WTO may be a little bit unfair. And also you mentioned Chinese play ahead, plan ahead, but I think that's because China is a communist party, country. Of course, the government plan, it's natural for them to do. You as private investors, like market-driven economy, so private investors do those. I just heard Jeff Bezos speak about his another company, like Blue Origin or something. He invests a lot of money to explore the space, and also the AI is kind of invented by IBM and Microsoft. So I don't believe just because China plan ahead, it seems they are trying to manipulate us.
Thanks. Thank you. You may want to respond to that or not.
Please. No. I am extraordinarily complimentary of the fact, very complimentary that China plans ahead. The U.S. needs to do that. I think it's fantastic China does. As I said in the beginning, they take the long view, and they're right to take the long view. I think it is commendable. I think you look at the progress China's made over the last 30 years, it is, well, there's no historic parallel. It is astonishing. So the thought that has gone into this and the programmatic implementation has been exceptional. I'm very admiring of what China has done. Think about poverty alleviation as only one element. China has brought 1 in every 10 people on the planet out of poverty. Think about that for a minute. So, to be clear, I am exceptionally admiring. Where I am not admiring is China's current treatment of foreign companies in its country. China's reform and opening, the golden period, I would say, is from Deng Xiaoping, say 1979, through roughly 2005, 6, like in that range. Certainly by 2007, the reform and opening began to slow. It has stopped. It's effectively stopped. Xi Jinping prioritized concentration of power and control over reform. I can understand why he did that. But he did. And the result is, in the place of further reform and opening, China has put in place a spate of measures that are highly discriminatory, zero-sum, highly mercantilist. That's what I'm critical of. I agree something like artificial intelligence isn't, the global system didn't even think about these concepts, but a subsidy is a subsidy. Favoring your domestic industry over others, that's still a subsidy. That's not WTO compatible. So, only point being, number one, I think China is brilliant to look ahead. They take the long view. It's the world's oldest continuous civilization, and one can see why. Number two, what it's accomplished over these 30 or 35 years, there's no historic parallel, none. Number three, is China continuing its reform and opening? No, it isn't. Number four, how do we get China back on that road? And this is where I said, you got to change the rules. I'd prefer to do that with China in new negotiations. If that's not possible, you have to change the rules with the countries with which China does business to push China in that more positive direction.
Thanks. Look, unfortunately, we've got a hard stop at 2:30, so I know there are other questions in the audience, but we're going to have to leave it at that. We've had a fascinatingly broad and deep conversation, so I'm not really going to make any attempt to summarise it. I think we're clearly in a brave new world. Things are probably on the trade and economic front going to get bumpier before they get better, and I think we've underscored the important role of allies and others who have gained from the economic system to step up while the United States steps back over the next few years. I want to thank our panellists for this fascinating conversation.